Now we are recording.
Boom. Kyle, you're cruising for a bruising.
Why are you talking about?
Okay, you'll grab your PowerPoints and you can turn to page 202. We're gonna sit here.
I probably clean them.
You don't even look that pregnant. Like from back behind.
It's not weight or anything.
It's like when you find out, that's when you start blowing up. Like some of the girls here, they were like so slim, and then when they found out, boom,
Yeah.
balloon.
Boom.
Probably just seems like that.
Boom.
Okay. So transmission of nerve impulses. Were all of you here for 6.1?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so a couple behavioral properties that neurons have or nervous tissue has. Y'all remember talking about behavioral properties of muscle tissue? Like one that was special to muscle tissue was that it had contractility, contract. Y'all remember any of the other ones of muscle?
Voluntary, involuntary.
Like flexibility? Flexibility was one. And extra
Elasticity.
elasticity.
Ooh,
Was there one more?
Contractibility.
She just said
I said that one. Sorry. Starts with an I.
irritability.
Irritability.
Oh,
Because it responds to a stimulus too. So transmission. And so neurons also have irritability. That's one of the behavioral properties, right? Because irritability means that it responds to a stimulus. So something makes it do something. Muscles do the same, right? Muscles have irritability because they can respond to a stimulus, right? A nervous impulse makes them respond. Behavioral properties, another behavioral property of nerves or neurons is conductivity, right? It's the ability to transmit a message or an impulse down its length into another one. Okay, does that make sense? Conducts impulses. So those are the two behavioral properties. So the three things we're going to talk about is action potentials, which is basically a fancy word for a nervous impulse. Okay, so that's just like your nerve impulse, the movement of the message, the movement of the message that it's conducting. Impulse transmission, which is what we'll talk about in a second, and then reflexes. So action potentials. So again, this is a nerve impulse, and you can look and follow along on 202 if you want to. So if you'll remember, we talked about this a little bit, but it's been a while. Okay, so this is my neuron. Okay. Let's talk about the parts of the neuron real quick. What's this part?
Which one?
This part.
The cell body.
Cell body. What are these?
Those are the legs.
Dendritic.
This one is hot.
They're the ones that receive a message. Right?
Yep.
This is called the
Axon.
axon. And what's the end of the axon? Terminal. Yes, the axon terminal.
Yeah.
Terminal just means end. Okay, so good. And these axon terminals, okay, the message goes this direction. Right? It starts received from here or starts here and heads down. Where's my things? It's going to be all messed up. Okay, now make my axon a little wider here. All right. So we're talking about action potential. You're talking about a nervous impulse. So the fact that this neuron can carry a message and send it on to something else. Now, when a neuron is polarized, everybody remember that word polarity?
Yes.
What does it mean? You're thinking on the right track, but which means that something has a charge. Okay, we were talking about that when we did chemistry and we talked about water and all that. So polarity. So when a neuron is polarized, okay, you've got a few things going on. Okay, it has potassium inside the cell, sodium outside the cell. Okay, so think of your potassium in here, and you got sodium out here. Now, when that neuron is resting, okay, so polarized is when it's resting. That's its resting state. You want to think of it that way. It's not doing anything. It's not sending a message. It's just hanging out. Okay. The inside of the cell, when it's polarized, is more negative than the outside. Or if you want to think of it as less positive, think of it that way. So there's less positive. There's less of these positive potassium ions than there are sodium ions on the outside. Right? That makes sense, everybody? That's its happy place. It's resting, it's not doing anything, it's just hanging out. Okay, now, that's polarized. So depolarization occurs when a stimulus, or when the neuron has been stimulated, by whatever that could be. Maybe it's stimulated by sensory receptors like in the fingertips, right, the dendrites. Or maybe it's been stimulated by another cell. Something along those lines. Where did I go? Okay, make sure I didn't get ahead of myself and miss something. So when depolarization happens, sodium, it says, rushes into the cell. So when that stimulus has reached the cell body, it's moving the message along. The way it does that, okay, is these sodiums, the cell membrane around the axon becomes permeable to sodium. So sodium rushes in. Okay? It's kind of like a zipper, and it goes down this direction. That's how it passes this message on. Okay? Does that make sense? So that happens to the point that the inside of the cell, at this point, becomes more positive than outside of the cell. So it changes its polarity. Does that make sense? Because the inside of the cell went from being more negative to now being more positive than the outside environment.
So what is that called? Is that
That's
polarized?
Depolarized.
That's depolarization, that process. So yeah, a depolarized neuron is one where all that sodium has rushed in, and now the inside's more positive than the outside. And the way that takes place is it just goes, it's like a zipper. It's like it fills in all the way down until it gets to the axon terminals. And then they're going to send a message on from there to the next thing. It's a muscle, or maybe it's another neuron. And that message, same thing's going to happen to the next.
What does this do though? Like, what does depolarized do to like your body or whatever?
Well, this is that electrical impulse that it's sending a message. So every time you have a thought, every time my arm moves, it's because my brain has decided it's time to move. So it sends a message down to my spinal cord, which sends the message out to the muscles in my arm. So that's the message. That's how it goes through it. That electrical impulse.
I just didn't know if there was like different movements or something for each.
Well, it would depend on, it's not necessarily, it's not like different types of electrical impulses, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, once you get down here, and we'll talk about this in a second, remember your axon terminal is not completely connected to like the muscle or whatever it is. There's a little gap in there. We'll see that there's a picture in a minute called the synaptic gap or synaptic cleft. And there are different neurotransmitters that can be released for different things. So for muscles, it's acetylcholine. Talk about that with the muscle chapter. So those little messages that they go across are acetylcholine. Those messages could be something different. There's different ones like for pain, stress, things like that. So yes, that part. But as far as the electrical impulse goes, it's the same thing. It's just going to depend on what kind of cell. All right, so if my brain tells my arms to move and wants my bicep to contract, it's only going to message, or it's only going to send nerve impulses or action potentials through the neurons that actually reach my bicep. So, does that make sense? But that's how those messages are sent. So this functions kind of like the difference. Okay, that's depolarization. It says it executes in an all or none fashion down the entire neuron. So it can't just stop in the middle and say, change our mind, we don't really want this to happen. It's all or none. It either goes all the way through or it doesn't go through at all. Okay, repolarization. Repolarization takes place when the membrane becomes permeable to potassium ions. Okay, so then the membrane changes after all this and the message has gone through. The membrane changes and potassium heads back out of the cell to make it the same as it was before, so that the charge of it is the same as it was before. Now, once that's all situated and it goes back to resting, it'll flip-flop back around so that there's more potassium inside, sodium on the outside. So it'll do that eventually, but for now, just changes this permeability so potassium can get back out and it can go back to its state where the inside was less positive than the outside. Try to get back to its happy place.
Gotcha.
One thing to know is that it can't respond to another stimulus until repolarization occurs. So until it's repolarized and back to its happy place, it can't be stimulated again. It's not just like that going crazy like it's been short or something in it, right? It goes all the way through, has to adjust back to how it was, go all the way through again.
I don't think that camera can see that on the board.
That's okay. They actually already saw this part. They just didn't get to the end. I'm just gonna went ahead and recorded it all in case I don't know what. But I was afraid I'd forget whenever we got to that part, so they can just fast forward through all this. Refractory period says is between the end of the action potential and repolarization. So that refractory period actually occurs right in here. And that's when it's fatigued. That's when it can't be re-stimulated. Okay. All right, so impulse transmission. All right, saltatory conduction. Let's talk about that first. Remember the other day we were talking about the myelin sheath? Remember that? That's those little kind of like Swiss roll looking cells that wrap around the axons of the neurons. What's their purpose? Do you remember?
To transmit impulses or something?
No.
Okay, so you
Hey, Cody, what is it?
Oh. It's
oh, you're flipping there. Okay.
it's like SERS. It's like insulating, and increases the rate of neural impulse transmission.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I just knew that off the top.
You're so smart. So you're right. So remember the myelin sheath wrap around. Now in the central nervous system, they're kind of all attached to that one cell. Anyway, but in the peripheral nervous system, which is kind of what we're talking about at this point, they are their own cells. So each swan cell is the name of these cells, and it wraps around like a Swiss roll or a jelly roll around the axon. So everybody remember what these little spots are called? The empty spots?
Oh, dang. I remember.
It's called
Are they the long O word?
the nose of Rangier.
Nose of Rangier. Good.
Woo!
So those are the nodes. So
What?
the way that when nodes of Rangier. Okay, so the way that an action potential travels through neurons that are myelinated, right? They have this myelin sheath, is that it actually jumps. It skips to each node. Jumps across that insulated myelin to each node, and that's how it moves. Okay, so it moves very, very quickly. Myelinated fibers and action potential can move through those much faster than other. But that is called saltatory conduction. The fact that it skips over that myelin sheath and it moves very quickly. That's what saltatory conduction is. Now, I think I told you the other day, multiple sclerosis is in multiple sclerosis, this myelin sheath actually breaks down. So they end up with a lot of like spastic type movements because it just can't conduct that impulse the way that it's supposed to. All right, so this is a synapse. This is a whole picture showing you a synapse. So this yellow, and this picture should be in your book.
Yeah.
On page 204, yeah. Okay, so this yellow, okay, this represents the axon up here. You'll listen, they won't be able to hear it on the video. So the axon up here, this is the axon terminal at the end of the axon. And if you'll notice, so here's got a muscle fiber. There's a gap in there. Those don't ever touch. Same thing. If this were another neuron down here that was going to pass the message on to, they wouldn't touch either. So that gap where they don't touch, it's called the synaptic cleft, or sometimes you'll hear me call it the synaptic gap. That's just how I learned. Okay, so this is the axon terminal. It's the end of it, and it passes on the nervous impulse. Okay, it doesn't with these what's called neurotransmitters. They're kind of like little bitty messengers, like hormones that send a message. So it makes sense. Neurotransmitter, right? Neuro means
Nerve.
nerve. Transmitter, right? Nerve transmits nerve. And on a message. So when when this has depolarized and this message is being sent through, these little vesicles that hold these neurotransmitters make their way to the end. You probably won't remember this, but anybody remember the name of this, the way that these are headed to the outside? And actually, the little membrane around these combines with the outside of the cell and then it empties. Starts with the E. It's a type of cell membrane transport. Sarah? Old. It's like second chapter. Third chapter. Yeah, I know. Okay. It's called exocytosis.
You know what? That's what I was thinking.
Exo means outside, so pushing it outside. Cyto, cell. Process of pushing it outside the cell. Makes sense. Endocytosis. Yeah. Anyways, it takes energy to do that, by the way. Those are anything else in the picture? Okay. So transmission at synapses. Well, I did forget one thing, but I'll go back to it in a second. I lost my spot now.
Brett, have you seen the red one?
I have not.
I knew.
Did you?
Yeah, I watched it. It's pretty intense.
No, probably.
You watched
Okay.
It was good though.
it?
Let me get back.
Facebook party.
I lost my spot.
I mean,
Okay, here we go. Transmission at synapses. Let's look at that on 203. So I didn't write down a bunch of notes. Okay, it says communication at the bottom on page 203 on the right side. Communication between some cells occurs through direct transfer of electrical charges at electrical synapses within specialized sites called gap junctions. One example of these is the intercalated disc. Remember we were talking about those in the muscle and cardiac muscle? Remember when we looked at the muscle tissue under a microscope and you could see those little lines?
Yes.
That's one example of gap junctions. It says communication between neurons, however, occurs at a synapse. So because the action potential is electrical, and what occurs at the synapse is chemical, transmission of nerve impulses is an electrochemical event, right? Because the electrical impulse travels through the neuron, okay? But then chemicals, the neurotransmitters are chemicals that pass the message from there. Okay? So you think about this. Every move you make, every eye movement, every time your eyes change to adjust to light, every thought you have, every time your heart beats, every time you breathe,
Everything.
everything you do, all this is going on all the time. Everything.
The
That-
hair flip.
It's crazy.
Crazy.
It is.
Cody.
Says when, on 204 at the kind of top left-hand side, second paragraph. When an action potential reaches an axon terminal, the terminal depolarizes. Okay, we're talking about the terminal here. Calcium gates open and calcium ions flow into the terminal. So calcium moves inside. The axon terminal is filled with tiny vesicles containing neurotransmitters, which is what we talked about a while ago. The influx of calcium causes these vesicles to join the cell membrane, right? They kind of attach and then they just spit out whatever neurotransmitter they have inside. It goes on to whatever, in this case, muscle fibers, what this one's talking about. Those neurotransmitters can have an excitatory effect or an inhibitory effect. And just, okay, it makes sense if you think about these. So an excitatory effect, says one example is acetylcholine. That's what activates muscle fibers. It makes them contract. Muscles only do one thing when they're stimulated. They contract, right? So that's an excitatory neurotransmitter. We talked about acetylcholine in the last chapter. So, okay, and inhibitory says endorphins are other endorphins are neurotransmitters released to inhibit nerve cells from discharging more pain signals. You know, they always say endorphins make you feel good, right? So, anyway, there you go. Inhibit pain signals. Kind of crazy to think about. So I hope that wasn't completely all Greek for you.
No.
Okay.
Have you
Makes
talked
sense.
about the electrochemical event before?
Yes.
Okay, but like that felt like so much deja vu just thinking about that.
So that's that. Real quick, a couple things I did not go over to was, okay, it says factors that affect speed. So factors that affect how fast a nerve impulse travels. One is the myelin sheath. We said myelinated neurons travel, what,
Basically.
fast or slow?
Fast, and they go really fast.
Right.
And jump, they jump.
That's the saltatory conduction is how that works. It says depolarization only occurs at the nodes. So that's how it goes so much faster. Okay, another thing that affects the speed is the diameter of the axon. So for neurons that are unmyelinated, that don't have that myelin sheath on them, the wide, like the bigger their diameter of the axon, the faster they're going to go. Which makes sense, right? It's more surface area to bring in more of those positive ions. And then the third factor is body temperature. And what do you think that correlation is? What do you think body temperature does?
Speeds
Speeds it up.
Speeds it up, okay? Just like your metabolism, right? Just like when we talked about, well, you talked about this probably in chemistry, but how ions move, like if you're talking about, you know, if you've got a,
cold in solids.
you're talking about, I don't know all the words because, you know, I'm not a chemistry teacher, but if you've got a bowl of salt water, you know, you've got salt ions, sodium ions that are floating around. If you heat it up, what happens to that movement?
It speeds up.
Right, it speeds up.
Mhm.
So same idea. Makes sense, right?
Yep.
And that's why I tell you, I know I say this 8,000 times all the time, but if you can relate things that you learn to things you already know, okay, and think it through, right? You would have been like, I don't know what, but if you think it through, you know what body temperature does to your metabolism, you know what it does to ions, you already know that answer. So that's one thing to, Okay. Oh, I didn't explain one thing. So the way that, so if you go back, if you're thinking about how this all transfers and this axon terminal sends these neurotransmitters into the muscle fiber or whatever, there's actually enzymes that come back and will attached to those extra neurotransmitters, so it doesn't continually cause that stimulation. If that makes sense. That's all. All right, reflexes. This is kind of crazy to think about. So you think about speed of your reflexes. It says limb position can travel. Let me read this over here. So, oh, wait, I wrote it in my notes. It's kind of crazy. Okay. Oh, I must have gotten this info somewhere else. Okay, I wrote down that limb position is fast, can be up to 119 meters per second. So you think about how quickly you can move, how quickly you know that you're moving. Makes sense, right? So 119 meters per second, that's really fast. But pain moves less than a meter per second. That pain stimulation. So a nerve impulse that travels to your brain and says that you're experiencing pain travels much, which makes sense because you know, like if you stub your toe sometimes, it takes a couple seconds for
Oh,
you to
no.
feel it.
It hurts like right then.
It takes usually, when you think about less than a meter per second, well, from your toe to your brain is a couple meters, depending on how tall you are.
Today, I was climbing over my desk, like
Oh.
to sit back down, and I hit my knee. It took me a minute to register what just happened, but then probably not started hurting.
Right, it takes.
Earlier this year, when that spider attacked me,
It's like,
like I didn't start feeling the pain until after that spider died. I realized I hit my knee on every desk. And I was really annoyed.
Well, that's because you also had endorphins going,
Yeah.
which inhibits pain because you had stress, you know, that stressor. So pretty cool. But you think about, you know, you don't even think about, like I don't think about moving my arm. I can just move it. I don't have to like, I know, I mean, you know, think about, it's crazy. So kind of cool, I think. All right, so transmissions, I already read all that. I'm
yeah.
crazy. Okay, reflexes.
So mad.
Simple, okay, reflexes are termed simple, rapid, involuntary, programmed responses to a stimulant. Simple, rapid,
Involuntary.
involuntary. And they're programmed responses. What does that mean?
They're already in your brain.
Okay, so they're programmed, right? You've already got a direction that you're going to go. They're simple because it doesn't take a lot of brain power for your reflexes to work. Right? It's a reflex. It works. Actually, most reflexes just go to your spinal cord and back down. They don't ever even go to your brain. Look at the bottom of 204. See how they touch the burner on the stove? So that's the sensory neuron, right? The afferent. Remember, A comes before E. Sensory is picking up, receiving the message. Heads up to, look, the spinal cord. It hits an inner neuron. Inter means
In between.
between. And then it heads back down to the motor neuron. It never even goes up to the brain. It's already programmed. It works very quickly, right? You don't have to think, this is hot. I should take my finger off. Right? It happens automatically. You don't think about it because it doesn't even go to your brain. It doesn't have to process it. It just goes to your spinal cord and right back down to the muscles that need to jerk it away.
Picture, like they have them touching it on purpose.
Well, yeah, I
Already
know.
red hot.
So that's a somatic reflex. Somatic has to do with your muscles. Anytime you hear that word somatic, think muscles or flesh. Like Soma is the name of a medication that's a muscle relaxant. It's probably, my guess is that's where it comes from. Okay? But somatic, those are your stimulate skeletal muscles specifically. Autonomic are your involuntary muscles. So, for example, you start exercising, what happens to your heart rate?
And it increases.
Speeds up, right? You get scared, what happens?
Your heart rate increases.
Okay, so those are examples of reflexes of your autonomic reflexes. And there's tons of those. Some of them are stretch reflexes, like when your stomach stretches, it stimulates your small intestine to start churning and moving food through it. So it's another example. Yeah. So when you start thinking about food, okay, there's another reflex, right? You start thinking about food, your stomach growls because your stomach starts churning, but there's nothing in it except for maybe some air. Right? So there you go.
Got stomach acid.
That's true. Well, and your stomach starts producing more acid and gastric juices when you get hungry too, when you start thinking about food or smelling food. All right, so a blank is an all or none response.
Isn't it
Well, there's only 4 options.
is it the action?
I'd say action potential, yeah. I guess that's what I was talking about. 2, blank occurs only in myelinated axons.
Saltatory
conduction. Good. 3, rapid involuntary responses.
reflexes.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
I messed up.
And then axon terminal has tiny vesicles filled with
Neural
neurotransmitters.
Hey,
Now you guys will get to anatomy and you'll go into a whole lot more detail on all of that, but there's at least, you get the basics down, you can learn the details later. You understand the basics.
Nice
It's cool,
concepting
though.
this bird.
Sure.
Yay.
Do you have some